But, all right, we're looking at the historical case for the resurrection of Christ. And I have to kind of keep you oriented where I am in the argument. Okay, and so the first point that I'm stressing, I'm going to be driving at this for a good while, in this historical case is that the disciples sincerely believed that Jesus had been resurrected. They were certain of it. And you say, well, how do you know that? How do you know that the original disciples were certain that they sincerely believed that Jesus had been raised from the dead? And we know that from several different lines of evidence. And I'm giving you the first line of evidence that establishes this. And that's that the original disciples, they claimed that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to him. They say that's what happened. So that's very good evidence. What do they believe and what do they think? Well, if they say it, that's a very good evidence of what they believe and what they thought happened. You say, well, how do you know that these original disciples thought that and said that? Well, we know that because we have multiple early and independent lines of evidence that make that clear. And I'm in the process of giving you that mountain of evidence, historical evidence that shows that they claimed Jesus rose from the dead. Now, why am I trying to get you to see that? Because that is the first line of evidence in establishing that they did in fact believe that Jesus rose from the dead. And the first line of evidence I gave you is Paul's very own words. We have in letters that everybody recognizes are Paul's letters. He says that he saw the resurrected Jesus. And his companion Luke corroborates that claim by giving accounts of Paul's experience on the Damascus Road. He also declares in many places, and I showed you these last week, many places in his letters that Jesus was raised from the dead. And Luke confirms that Paul says that because Luke gives us sermons from Paul. And so Luke says, yeah, Paul here, he was saying on this occasion, he said, Jesus is risen from the dead. So we not only have Paul's own words, we have Luke's corroboration of that. And Paul was also well acquainted with Peter and the other apostles and the gospel that they preach. And then we see that he asserts in public letters that are intended to be read publicly during the lifetime of those apostles Paul knows and whose gospel he knows. He says in those public letters that Jesus appeared to those apostles and that those apostles preach the resurrection of Christ. Now, if they didn't, if that was false, if that was a lie, don't you think that would come back to Paul? Some of you say, oh, what are you doing? What are you talking about? I know Peter. He's a friend of mine. And he didn't say that. No, he says it without fear of contradiction. And on top of that, we know from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 to 5, that within 20 years of Christ's death, probably within 6 or 7 years of his death, there was this creedal formula circulating. This statement was circulating that included not only belief in Christ's resurrection, but also the assertion that he'd been seen by Peter and the 12. So we have Paul's testimony, and in addition, we have the 4 Gospels. And they provide powerful historical evidence that the original disciples claimed that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to them. The Gospels say that. They say that Jesus rose and appeared to the disciples. And I'm currently providing the reasons for belief. You say, well, why should I believe? You've told me about Paul's letters. Everybody accepts those 7 letters are from Paul. You've showed me that. Well, why should I believe that there's any historical value in the Gospels? Why should I think that they have any historical credibility, that they are reliable indicators of what the early disciples claim? And what I'm doing now, I'm giving you reasons for understanding and accepting that the Gospels are, in fact, good historical evidences. And the first thing that I was talking about is just in terms of their reliability generally. And I made the case that, look, there are good reasons for believing that the four Gospels were in fact written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And that's significant because if that's true, then they are written by people who are in a very good position to understand and to have the knowledge that they're communicating. So they're prime candidates. They're in a very good spot. But even if one denies that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the Gospels, even if you say that, most liberals accept that the dating of the Gospels between 40 and 70 years after the events that they report. And, this is in a time when eyewitnesses would be around, and so you would expect the eyewitnesses to serve as a restraint on their deviation from the truth. All right, all of that's kind of racing through to get you to where we ended last week. Still on there, the reliability of the Gospels generally. In addition to those things that I just rattled off, there's evidence, the evidence is mounting, that prior to the writing of the Gospels, the stories about Jesus, they were transmitted not only orally, but also in written form in notebooks. This evidence is increasing. These writings would supplement and support the oral forms of remembering and teaching. Such notebooks, they were used widely in antiquity, and given that Jesus' disciples were drawn from all classes of people, they no doubt included professional scribes and copyists. So as Balcom says, it seems more probable than not that early Christians used them. Richard Balcom writes, he says, in such a context, it does seem unlikely that no one would have noted down Jesus' traditions in notebooks for the private use of Christian teachers. Such notebooks would not be a wholly new factor in the process of transmission through memorization that we described in the last section. They would simply have reinforced the capacity of oral transmission itself to preserve the traditions faithfully. All right, the New Testament scholar Michael Bird, he was skeptical about the prospect of notebooks being used to preserve Jesus' teaching, but his consideration of the evidence and the arguments on the subject changed his mind, and he concluded in his book, The Gospel of the Lord, 2014 book, The Gospel of the Lord, How the Early Church Wrote the Story of Jesus. Michael Bird says, thus it is highly probable that notebooks were used by Jesus' own disciples and by later adherents in the early church to assist in memory retention by functioning as an aid memoir. So in talking about why I think that these gospel reports are historically credible, that they have any value in that regard, well, that's another reason. So it shouldn't surprise us that the Gospels, they fare very well when you assess them by using the criteria, the standard criteria that historians use, the diagnostic questions that historians traditionally ask of ancient writings in trying to assess their credibility, their historical reliability. There are a number of questions they ask, so it shouldn't surprise us when we ask those questions of the Gospels that they fare quite well. And here you see the first question, I put them as statements. See, the question would be that they would ask of ancient documents, do the authors include details that risk damaging their own case or their own cause? I've just made them as statements. The Gospels, the authors include details that risk damaging their own cause, which they would not do unless they were interested in remaining faithful to history. Why would you include something that risks damaging your own point and your own cause unless you were interested in the truth, unless you were interested in the history of the thing? As Paul Eddy and Gregory Boyd write, they said the synoptics are brimming with, quote, embarrassing material, which we not only cannot imagine early Christians inventing, but which we might have expected the earliest traditions to drop were they not so invested in retaining historically rooted information about Jesus. For example, you say, well, what are you talking about? Well, for example, Jesus' baptism by John. That baptism by John, well, that's an inconvenient fact, right, that required an explanation. Why is the one you claim to be the Son of God, why is he submitting to baptism by a sinner? Okay, it required explanation. And the supremely inconvenient truth was Jesus' crucifixion by the Romans. Right, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1:23, it was a stumbling block to Jews, foolishness to the Gentiles. So you say, but it's front and center in the Gospels. So there you see a criterion of historical reliability. Likewise, the authors of the Gospels, they omit material you might expect them to include if they weren't constrained by the truth. For example, why not put on Jesus' lips answers to the questions that arose in the church after Jesus' death? In other words, if I'm just making this stuff up way down the road, well, then why not just make up that Jesus said answers to all the questions, like how Jewish do Gentiles have to be when they convert? That was a big issue in the early church. Well, why don't I just put in Jesus' mouth the answer to that? How about the situation with idol feasts? I could have Jesus pontificate on that and decree on that. But he doesn't do any of that. Right? Unlike you see in Joseph Smith, the things that are supposedly revealed to him. He addresses all of these theological questions that were there. So if this is a much later thing and you're just inventing it then, why not put on Jesus, in Jesus' mouth, answers to those questions? All right, that indicates, see, that no, this goes back deeper. This is back deeper. Now the second the standard criteria, the second criterion is the authors include incidental details and casual information. So the diagnostic question you ask is, does the ancient writing include that kind of stuff? Incidental details and casual information. Well, in the Gospels, the answer is yes, which suggests they're presenting factual data material derived from an eyewitness perspective. I mean, there's a ton of this in the Gospels. There's a ton of this. Indeed, Wolfgang Schadewalt, who's a respected scholar of ancient Greek literature, he says, as a philologist, someone who has acquired some knowledge of literature, I'm particularly concerned here to note that when we read the synoptic Gospels, we cannot be other than captivated by the experiential vividness with which we are confronted. I know of no other area of history writing, biography, or poetry where I encounter so great a wealth of material in such a small space. I mean, as an example, in Mark chapter 4, verse 36, it includes the fact that when the disciples took Jesus with them in a boat, other boats were with him. Look at that little other boats were with him. R.T. France in his commentary says it's hard to see any other reason for their inclusion beyond the circumstantial reminiscence on the part of whoever told the story, that as a matter of fact, their boat was not alone on the lake that evening. And you see that. Likewise, in Mark chapter 6, verse 39, it reports that at the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus commanded them to sit down on the green grass. Sit down on the green grass. France says the vivid description suggests the eyewitness account of someone who was present at this extraordinary picnic. I mean, there are many things like this in the Gospels, all kinds of things. They don't just go general on you. You know, like when I've mentioned before, somebody gets pulled over by the cops and they're investigating something. They're always there. I don't know. Who is this? Where were they? What were their name? I don't know. The Gospels aren't like that. You have a lot of this detail and the naming of specific people who can be questioned about the veracity of the report. That signals eyewitness accounts. I'm naming people. You can go track them down. You can check it out. For example, Mark writes in Mark 15:21 that they compelled a passerby. Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, they compelled him to carry the cross. So here's this story out there. You've got Simon of Cyrene. He's the father of Alexander and Rufus. Don't you think somebody could go look up Alexander and Rufus? Or if it's just made up, they'll go, there is no Simon of Cyrene. There are no kids Alexander and Rufus. But they're not afraid to give the kind of details that can be checked out. The women at the crucifixion and the tomb, they're specifically identified by name in Mark 15:40 as are various beneficiaries of Jesus' healings. Jairus, Bartimaeus, Lazarus, Mary Magdalene. And you have one of the disciples to whom Jesus appeared on the road to Damascus, on the road to Emmaus, Cleopas. Richard Bauckham, he concludes, he says, the named characters were eyewitnesses who not only originated the tradition to which their names are attached, but also continued to tell these stories as authoritative guarantors of the tradition. So this was my story. I tell this story. I was there. I know what happened. So as I'm doing this, if you're coming up with a contrary account, I'm the authority and I trump your bogus account. You see, this all goes to the credibility of what's going on. Then we have another one here, the third criterion. It says there's sufficient consistency within and between the Gospels to preserve their general reliability. All right, that would be the question you ask of these ancient writings. In other words, just assume for the purposes of argument that the Gospels are not inerrant and contain genuine inconsistencies. I don't believe that. But just assume that for purpose of the argument that they do contain genuine inconsistencies. Well, those inconsistencies are at least on a par with what one finds in other works whose general reliability historians are willing to grant. That's a quote from Eddy and Boyd, right? So even if we say, there are some genuine inconsistencies, those inconsistencies are no greater than those that are in other historical writings that people grant the reliability of. So even if I said that, I said, even if there were genuine inconsistencies, Eddy and Boyd, they say the Gospels can be seen as exhibiting the sort of broad internal consistency that suggests that the authors both intended to faithfully record the essential aspects of Jesus' life and teaching, and that, as far as we can tell, they were quite successful at doing so. Now, I think the case is stronger than that, because not only can the apparent, not genuine, not only can the apparent, the superficial inconsistencies be harmonized, made to fit together in plausible, albeit speculative ways, right? Sometimes when we're harmonizing something, you say, well, you have this report here that's superficially inconsistent with it. I say, well, wait a minute now. They would fit together if this was the case. Okay, that's speculative, but it's plausible. All right, so there are plausible ways of harmonizing these things, but the important thing to recognize is that the very presence of the superficial, the apparent inconsistencies shows that the accounts are not latter-day concoctions. Because if they were, then those superficial inconsistencies would have been removed and ironed out. Right, here's what N.T. Wright says. He says, the surface inconsistencies between Mark 16:1-8 and its parallels, of which so much is made by those eager to see the accounts as careless fiction, is in fact a strong point in favor of their early character. In other words, they're going back to what the original disciples said. They're rooted in that early testimony. He says, the later we imagine them being written up, let alone edited, the more likely it would be that inconsistencies would be ironed out. The stories exhibit, as has been said repeatedly over the last 100 years or more, exactly that surface tension we associate not with tales artfully told by people eager to sustain a fiction and therefore anxious to make everything look right, but with the hurried, puzzled accounts of those who have seen with their own eyes something which took them horribly by surprise and with which they have not yet fully come to terms. Their minds were blown when they saw this. And so in terms of looking at the documents and saying, are these things, how do they fare in terms of these markers, traditional criteria that are applied to assessing the historical reliability? I mean, they fare quite well. Now, the Gospels, then the fourth one says the Gospels do not report events or make claims that seem inherently improbable. That's one of the things you say. Does the ancient document, does it make claims that seem inherently improbable? And what I'm contending here is that the Gospels do not report events that seem inherently improbable, provided that one is willing to entertain the possibility of God's existence and His working miracles. That one is open to that possibility. Right? If the historian deems miracles are impossible, in other words, if I'm a historian, I say miracles are impossible. Before I do any investigation, before I try to determine what actually happened, if I say up front miracles are impossible, well then that metaphysical assumption will force him to judge as historically unreliable any report that a miracle occurred. Right? Regardless of its strength when measured by conventional standards of historiography. It won't matter. Because I've already said, I've assumed this cannot happen. So I don't care what the evidence is that it did happen. It will never outweigh this because that's my assumption. It can't happen. Oh, you're saying that happened? Can't happen. Now, in another context, we just simply call that having a closed mind. Right? That's what we would call that, simply having a closed mind. It's like the old story about the psychiatric patient who was certain that he was dead. Just knew he was dead. And in an attempt to persuade him otherwise, his doctor, he had a great idea. His doctor said, well, do dead men bleed? And the patient said, well, of course not. And the doctor then nicked his forearm with a razor and stared triumphantly as the blood oozed out. And he asked the patient, said, so what do you think now? Patient responded, well, what do you know? Dead men do bleed. You see, this is the same idea. You see, it can't happen. Okay, well, no evidence is going to convince them. No evidence is going to convince them. Now, some people try to justify this. This may be consider this a footnote, but some people try to justify this closed-mindedness by appeal to the historical, not accepting the historical evidence. They justify it by appeal to the argument of the 18th century Scottish philosopher, a guy named David Hume. You've undoubtedly heard his name somewhere in your travels. Well, Hume's argument that given the evidence of countless confirmations of the laws of nature in everyday experience, it's always more reasonable to believe that a miracle did not occur than to believe that it did. This is his approach. In other words, miracles are so improbable in light of the uniform experience of humanity that no amount of historical evidence can outweigh that improbability in any given case. So people try to justify that and say, no, that's a very rational way of approaching the subject of miracles. But if God exists, right, if he exists, then miracles can occur, and the only way to determine whether a miracle in fact happened in any given case is to weigh the evidence regarding that specific event. You can't turn the rarity of miracles into a basis for refusing to believe the evidence for a miracle. You see, just think about it. Think about under Hume's argument. If we stipulate that a miracle actually occurred, let's just stipulate a miracle actually occurred, he could never know it. His approach has barred him methodologically from ever knowing that the miracle occurred. So that ought to tell you something right there. I mean, he'd be forced to deny it. However compelling the evidence, however much I piled up the evidence and said, look, I've got this testimony, this video recording, this, that, he'd just blow it all off. He could never find that truth. See, because he would say, look, well, yeah, but all that evidence swamped by the countless times that miracles didn't occur. And see, that's having eyes and not seeing, ears and not hearing. Here's what Michael Licona says. He says, if we assume that God does not exist, then of course it's more probable that men would lie than that nature would alter its course. However, if we are open to God's existence, we will need to ask at least 3 additional questions. Is there good evidence that the event in question occurred? Does a context exist in which we might expect a God to act? Is there good evidence that those making the claim lied? If good evidence exists that the event occurred, a context exists where we might expect a God to act, and there is an absence of evidence for a lie, then there is no reason to believe that a lie is more probable than a miracle in a specific instance. If one were then to continue believing that deceit was involved, he would not have weighed the evidence, but weighed in with his bias. That's what that is. It's just a naturalistic bias, masquerading as, well, I'm the man who's open to evidence. No, you're not. You see, you have a metaphysical assumption that's driving how you view the evidence. The evidence is what I'm giving you. You're blowing it off is because you refuse to accept what the evidence is telling you. That's bias. That's closed mind. Don't come to me with some kind of high deal like, I'm really the guy who cares about what the evidence says. That's not the case at all. You're the guy who's rejecting what the evidence says. Now, if you are interested in David Hume, here are refutations of Hume's argument in detail. For example, John Ehrman, Hume's Abject Failure, The Argument Against Miracles, published by Oxford University Press in 2000. Here are 3 book sections of Licona's book, 135 to 153. You can dig into that to your heart's content. J.P. Moreland and William Lane Craig, they say in their book, Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview, these are both philosophers, they say it would be fair to say that the fallaciousness of Hume's reasoning has been recognized by the majority of philosophers writing on the subject today. Okay, I remember when Alyssa was in school, I don't know if high school, I think it was high school, some teacher of hers was trying to wow her with David Hume. Oh, he's already established that miracles can occur. All right. Well, he needs to read around. That's what I'm telling you. Majority of philosophers think that's junk. All right, so it's not some silver bullet, some great thing. All right, the 5th criterion. The gospel accounts are corroborated by as much external literary evidence as reasonably can be expected. Okay, so this is one of the things I want to know from an ancient document. I'm assessing its historical reliability. How good is it for giving me good stuff, truthful testimony about what happened in the past? I said, well, is it corroborated by any external literary evidence? Is there anything outside of it that reinforces it or supports it? And the Gospels are corroborated by as much literary evidence as reasonably can be expected. You say, well, why do you say as reasonably can be expected? Well, remember that the vast majority of all that was written in the ancient world has perished. It's simply disintegrated. It's disappeared. You know, you say, well, that's a shame. I agree. But it's a fact. You say, why did that happen? Well, stuff just, decays and doesn't get copied enough. And you have wars where things get burned. You have persecutions where things get destroyed like that. But the vast majority of all that was written, it has perished. And you have to remember that a new religion arising in a remote region of the Roman Empire would not likely attract the attention of Roman historians. Some backwater of the Roman Empire, these Roman historians, you think that's going to be their focus? They're going to be all interested in that? But that said, we do have a number of pieces of outside literature that support aspects of the early Jesus tradition. Let me give you some of the more important ones. You may, I hope anyway, that these are familiar to you. But Thales was a Roman historian who apparently wrote a 3-volume chronicle of world history in the mid-50s. So he writes this work in the mid-50s. That's right around when Paul's writing his letters, 1 Corinthians. He writes a 3-volume history of the world. Now that work is lost. But we know of Thales' work from the early 4th century church historian Eusebius, and from a reference to it by a 3rd century Christian historian named Julius Africanus. In the course of discussing the darkness that fell on the land during Jesus' crucifixion, Africanus writes, he says, in the 3rd book of his history, Thales calls this darkness an eclipse of the sun. Wrongly, in my opinion. Of course it's wrong because Jesus is crucified at Passover, which is a full moon, so the sun and moon are on opposite sides. For an eclipse, the moon has to be between the earth and the sun. So he says wrongly, in my opinion. Of course it's wrong, but that's not the point. You see, the point is that Thales, here he seems to acknowledge the odd, prolonged darkness during Jesus' crucifixion through his attempt to explain it away. Right? He seems to accept it. And this, he's writing in the 50s, and he seems to recognize that there is a phenomenon here that needs an explanation, and he says, well, it was an eclipse. All right, well, I think that's pretty significant. We have that there. Now, Josephus, Jewish historian, he was born in AD 37. And he was captured by the Romans in the Jewish revolt. Okay, the Jewish revolt is from 66. Jerusalem was destroyed in 70. And you have Masada 2 or 3 years later. Okay, but he was captured during that. But he wrote his work, Jewish Antiquities, around AD 95. And this work has 2 sections of particular interest for our study. What's called the James passage. It says, when therefore Ananus, who was a high priest, was of this angry disposition, he thought he had now a proper opportunity to exercise this authority. Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. He wasn't there yet. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, or some of his companions. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. So here we have Josephus confirms the New Testament claims that Jesus was called Christ and that James was his brother. So that's something. And then there's a section of Josephus that is known as the Testimonium Flavianum. Okay, that's this section of Josephus. And it's widely believed, that particular section is widely believed to contain Christian interpolations. In other words, it's generally accepted that the surviving copies that we have of Josephus, the surviving copies, they're based on copies that were made by Christians who put into Josephus's mouth certain remarks when they're copying what he has to say about Jesus. They put in his mouth some extra words. Okay? So you say, okay, well, how do we get through that? How do we chart through that? Well, based on an Aramaic translation, an Arabic translation of this section, this Testimonium Flavianum, an Arabic translation of this section that was published in 1971, that has been very beneficial in helping us reconstruct, well, what was Josephus? What did he originally write? And we can now be pretty sure about it. We can have a great deal of confidence in it, a high degree of confidence. In the words of James Charlesworth, who is a very well-known scholar, Charlesworth says, we can now be as certain as historical research will presently allow that Josephus did refer to Jesus in this particular section of Antiquities. Okay, so we have a good thing about we can figure out what Josephus originally said. And the most common reconstruction of this particular passage of Josephus, based on this Arabic translation and all the work that scholars have done, the most common reconstruction of it is, about this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, for he was one who wrought surprising feats and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him. So in other words, he's dead, but they didn't give up their affection for him. And the tribe of the Christians, so-called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. So here we have Josephus confirming that Jesus was a teacher, that he performed what appeared to be supernatural feats, that he was crucified under Pilate, and his followers continued to have affection for him after his death. So this is Josephus' writings in about 95, still in the first century. In about 112, AD 112, Pliny the Younger, he was governor of Bithynia. That's this region up here. Well, I'm too stupid to see where the thing is, but you see it, Bithynia, Pontus. Okay, he was the governor of that region. He wrote a letter to the Roman emperor. At that time, the emperor was Trajan. And he writes him a letter for advice on how he should deal with the Christians in his territory. This is 112, very early 2nd century. He writes this. And we see what he says is, meanwhile, in the case of those who were denounced to me as Christians, I've observed the following procedure. He's letting the emperor know, this is what I've decided to deal with, how I deal with them. I want you to tell me if this is okay. I interrogated these as to whether they were Christians. Those who confessed, I interrogated a second and third time, threatening them with punishment. Those who persisted, I ordered executed. So he gave them a couple chances to denounce Christ. You didn't, you're dead. They asserted, however, that the sum and substance of their fault or error had been that they were accustomed to meet on a fixed day between dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a God, and to bind themselves by oath not to some crime, but not to commit fraud, theft, or adultery, not falsify their trust, nor to refuse to return a trust when called upon to do so. So they committed themselves to moral and righteous living in the name of Jesus Christ. They gathered together on a certain day, and they sang hymns to Christ as to a God. So here we see that. So his letter tells us Christians at that time, they worshiped Jesus as God. which confirms the view that we see in the New Testament, that Jesus is in fact divine. It also tells us that some Christians were willing to die for this belief. So I think that's significant corroboration. The Roman historian, a man named Cornelius Tacitus, he wrote his work Annals of Rome around AD 115. Okay, again, early 2nd century. AD 115. And in describing how Emperor Nero tried to divert the blame for starting a fire in Rome in AD 64. So he's writing in about 115. He's doing a history of Rome, but he's a Roman historian. He writes about how Nero tried to dodge the blame for having started the fire that burned down a large section of Rome. And Tacitus says, consequently, to get rid of the report that he ordered the fire. That was the rumor that was going around. And Nero's going, this isn't good. To have the people start saying that I started this thing because, politics was really rough back then. And so he's going, uh-oh. So Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations. Well, this is how this Roman feels about it. These Christians, they're enemies of the state because they reject our panoply of gods. They're getting Rome in trouble. They won't worship our gods, and the gods will get angry. They say there's only one God. They're dissing the other gods. All right, so he says there's tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty, crucifixion, during the reign of Tiberius, at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a deadly superstition thus checked from him. That superstition would be he rose from the dead. A deadly superstition thus checked for a moment broke out, or the whole faith, broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but also in the city, Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world meet and become popular. Now, Paul Barnett, he summarizes the significance of this statement in Tacitus in his book, Is the New Testament Reliable? A Look at the Historical Evidence. Paul Barnett says, in one sentence of the above passage, Tacitus confirms 5 details mentioned in the New Testament. The public career of Christ occurred in the time of Emperor Tiberius. Pontius Pilate was the governor when Christ died. Christ was executed as a criminal. This occurred in Judea. The movement spread from Jerusalem to Rome. So we see that. Now, see, I got 1 minute to go. No, I have no minutes. It just clicked on me. Okay. Lord willing, next week. Thank you.